Welcome, everyone. Thanks for attending our Fireside. So tonight is a special edition Fireside because we are announcing our Compassionate Impact Grant recipient. The Compassionate Impact Grant is a revamp of our humanist grants, and it is a 3-year, $150,000 grant to a single organization that addresses food insecurity, education, health, or poverty within underserved communities. Before we get started, I do have a couple announcements to make. The first one is that today is the start of Secular Week of Action that goes from today until May 9th, and you can still sign up. We encourage you to sign up for service events. We already have several organizations and members, individuals who have signed up at www.weekofaction.org. All right, so the second announcement, I am very excited to announce that FBB is launching a pilot program that addresses food insecurity. With the pandemic, there was a 23% increase in food insecurity in the US, and this is why we decided to launch the program. So we are giving out a monthly grant to 5 teams in our pilot program. We hope to expand this eventually to the entire Beyond Belief network. But thus far, our 5 teams are Atheists United, Austin Atheists Helping the Homeless, Atheists, the Community of Polk County, Austin Humanists at Work, and Humanist Community of Greater Phoenix. So they will each be receiving a monthly grant, and that will help them address food insecurity. All right, that's it for our announcements. And I'm really excited today to be joined by Hayden Dansky, who is the Executive Director of Food Rescue Alliance. Food Rescue Alliance is our Compassionate Impact Grant recipient for the 2021 fiscal year. And Hayden here has joined us to tell you all about it. So I'm just going to turn the floor over to Hayden.
Thank you, Tiff. Thank you, everybody, for being here and for the grant and everything that you're doing in the country. I feel really excited and honored to be in this space. And I did prepare like a little presentation just to share with you all a little bit about, again, my name is Hayden. My pronouns are they, them, theirs. And Food Rescue Alliance is currently a program of Boulder Food Rescue. And so I serve as the executive director of both Boulder Food Rescue and Food Rescue Alliance right now. And to kind of tell you a little bit about what Food Rescue Alliance does, it's probably easiest to share a little bit about Boulder Food Rescue and our programming on the ground, and then we can kind of expand out from there. We started in 2011, really to address the issues of food waste and food insecurity. We saw that there was an immense amount of really healthy, uncut produce going to waste. And we knew that that was something was wrong, that shouldn't be going to waste, but also that people in our community needed it. And a couple of things that we sought out to do was really address the gap that existed. We talked to the food banks and the pantries, and we tried to understand what are the systems kind of at play here. And specifically with healthier food and the more perishable food, by the time that food would get picked up, taken to a warehouse, sorted, redistributed out to a pantry, and then out to people, 3 to 7 days could pass. And in that time, it was going to go bad. So we created a model to go directly from a grocery store that was going to donate it to a community to use right away. The other kind of, I think, important piece of what we do is we do take food to places like pantries or meals or programs that are serving the community food, but we saw pretty quickly on that not all of those programs are necessarily accessible to all people, that they seemed kind of barriered. And we wanted to take food directly to people where they could use it, have power and autonomy over how those programs run. And that is essentially what we call the no-cost grocery program. So we take food to places where people are already going to be, affordable housing sites, preschools, daycares, and then people in those places have full power and autonomy over those food access programs. They receive the food, they sort the food, they know their neighbors, they distribute it out. And what that does is it decreases a lot of really tangible barriers like hours of operation that a program might be open or transportation to get to that program. But it also increases community connection. It gets people out of isolation. It enables people to build trust with one another, to build relationships with one another. And it destigmatizes food access because the food is distributed by neighbors for neighbors, by community for community. And so there's less of this kind of hierarchical charitable system where the people who have resources set the rules and the people who don't get a voice or a say. They really have, we kind of try to take that and flip it on its head, where they have a voice in how things work, and that influences how we operate as an organization. And so it creates health in this very physical way around like the foods that people get look and taste good to them. It's the foods that people want. We find people particularly want more produce because it's harder to get in other places. And it also increases emotional health, mental health by increasing that community connection. And giving people power, which we're learning that power is also a social determinant of health. Having the ability to give back and have a voice that is valued is beneficial for people. And we find that there was a recent study that came out in Colorado that said somebody who's experiencing food insecurity, even with the charitable food system and systems like SNAP and WIC that are like absolutely life-saving and beneficial. But even with those, they're experiencing the health effects or outcomes of someone who is 14 years older than them. So somebody who's like 65 and experiencing food insecurity might be living with the same health outcomes as someone who is 79. And so we know that this is really impactful in a lot of different holistic ways. So I say all of that because a lot of this, the nature of this model, I think, I did move this here. The nature of this model is it's built around participation. We've come to study participation, and what that word means to us is the ways in which people who are program users are able to be involved in the efforts to improve food access. This is like the ways in which people are involved in our programming, but also in our staff and in our board and in our strategic planning process, and really helped set the direction of the organization. Communities have really been supporting each other in their own health and well-being for ever. And we try to acknowledge that and honor that and leverage that community involvement to support their own health and well-being. So the concept of participation in our day-to-day programming, this I should also say is some quotes directly from our participation framework. So we studied this and we really wanted to understand how do people want to be involved in these systems and what in nonprofits is preventing people from really having a meaningful voice, is what is like the barriers and the things that are kind of coming up against, people give feedback, but they don't ever feel like it's heard, or they have ideas, they don't know how to give them. And our participation framework also helps walk nonprofits through how to look at their own systems and see how to become more participatory. So I say that word a lot, but I really want to name that this is happening like right on the ground. And it also happens all throughout Food Rescue Alliance. It's a really big, important part of our process to be member run. And so Food Rescue Alliance is started in a couple of years later. Really in 2012, we got a little bit of national press on NPR. We didn't think much of it. It was a big deal because we got a tiny blurb in NPR, but we didn't know what would happen. But after a little while, people started reaching out to us and saying, hey, I want to start a food rescue in my program, in my city. How do I do that? Do you have advice? And so as a response to that, we came up with what we call the package deal. And it was a how to create your own food rescue in your city guide. And we initially, our original one was in 2012. we just updated it in 2019 because we learned a lot since then. But it had things like donor forms. How do you find food donors, find recipients? How do you apply for nonprofit status? What are ways to engage your volunteers, fundraising? And it was everything that we had learned so far. And so we put out this guide, and there were a few organizations in particular that did really well. And the ones that did well were organizations that we actually had connections to. So there were previous volunteers for Boulder Food Rescue that had moved back to their home cities, or that we had some kind of connection with them in Denver and Colorado Springs, and Jackson Hole. And so what we noticed was that the guide was a great start, but when we were able to talk on the phone and give advice and help them kind of think through questions like, oh, who should be on my board, or who could help me with this, I don't know, challenge I'm having in the community. Those were the types of organizations that really started thriving. And so we kind of had this slow growth over time. It really started as kind of this regional Colorado to Wyoming thing, because that's where we were connected. And it kind of expanded really naturally on its own, with very little input. We've never done any outreach, and we've now grown to about 32 organizations. I should also say we have photos here of bikes. Bikes and trailers is one way that Boulder Food Rescue in particular does distribution, and some of the other organizations do as well. But we don't have any requirements around that. We really believe that every community is different. And so instead of this kind of one size fits all model, it's more like, you know your community best, you know what your city needs. How can we share things that are maybe standardized, like a 501c3 application, for example, but really encourage a diversity of models, and a knowing that these systems of both food waste and food insecurity are really complex, right? And that we don't kind of stay away from the one simple solution idea, and say, no, we need difference and connection. And so Boulder Food Rescue is bikes. Not all of the Food Rescue Alliance chapters do, but some do, depending on where they are. And today we now have 32 different organizations across the country. And they started popping up as people started kind of either starting their own food rescues or started getting in touch with us, because we have a few different, I guess, presence on the internet, and people would find us and want to get connected. Now our 32 members distribute about 20 million pounds of food annually, and we have done about 90,000 pickups on our current software, but that's not even everybody. And so this work is happening kind of simultaneously all over the country, because we haven't necessarily done intentional outreach, and that's kind of where we're going. We are kind of scattered, but we also have some clusters. One is in Colorado. We have another cluster in New York now, which is really interesting, and one kind of starting up in California. So again, like I said, we try to encourage this localized solution. And also what we're seeing now is also a more regional solution. So organizations that have other organizations in their kind of area are starting to get together and kind of form regional alliances. There's a new New York meeting that is kind of happening on its own. So we are working towards a more just and less wasteful food system from that local level. But we connect through peer learning, resource sharing, and experimentation. We're trying to do things kind of radically different than what we've seen in the past, where it's more from the ground up, but we let our values drive our work. And the shift really went from what previously was us kind of consulting, knowing that we don't have all the answers, and Boulder's really different and weird, and really trying to do more peer-to-peer learning. So an organization that might have a challenge that's really different than what our challenge is, we can connect with an organization that might be similar. So we connect urban organizations together and rural organizations together, for an example of what that kind of looks like. Some of our kind of I guess, offerings that we have to the network is kind of what I said, this one-on-one consulting service. And that's really to help a lot of food rescues who are just getting started. They can use that direct one-on-one support a lot. Again, to kind of look at things that are standardized, like how do I, apply for this 501c3 status, or thoughts on how to write grants and get grants, all the way to questions about who should be on my board, and how do I work with donors to ensure that I'm getting enough food, or recruiting volunteers. So we do a lot of kind of direct support for startups. Again, we have this peer learning network where we connect organizations that might have similar challenges. And the other kind of way that we share, I guess, learning is through workshops. So every month we have a meeting. Sometimes they're just member meetings where a proposed topic or topics really come up. Well, we might do working groups now, as in we do Zoom rooms around certain discussion topics. But the other kind of month, we do a workshop that is specific to something somebody wants to learn. And we'll either find an organization that really excels at that to teach that workshop, or we'll find an outside organization that might be experts in that topic to come and teach Food Rescue Alliance. And so it's a more like focused, I want to learn about volunteer retention or alternative fundraising strategies, or advocacy 101. And so those kind of requested topics, we find relevant leaders and teachers around that. And then the last kind of way that we share resources is through document sharing. Anything, again, that's like kind of more standardized that can be really helpful, like example bylaws or budgets, food safety guidelines, things like that, we offer to people. I think, yeah, the next slide is like, this is kind of what it looks like. We have this Google Drive that's just examples from organizations that everyone kind of collectively puts in their materials for others to see. And that way we don't have to spend all of this time recreating things that could be standardized. I mean, things like conflict of interest policies, things like, again, food safety guidelines. Those things are pretty standardized across the country. So it helps us just save time to be able to have access to those things. And then some of the documents that we share and resources that we share are also created by us. So as well as, besides just like the how to start your own food rescue guide, we recently responded to the COVID crisis with a food procurement guide. We saw when the pandemic hit, people's food donations were all over the place. Grocery stores went down, restaurants went up because they were closing. Farmers didn't know what to do with their food. And so there was kind of this big question, are we going to be able to procure enough food to feed our increase of people who need access to it? So we were able to work with organizations who are doing really well to understand how are they procuring food, and then pretty rapidly put out here's a bunch of resources that these other organizations who maybe aren't sure how to do this could utilize. And so some of them are also self-created. We saw in the pandemic that this model of no-cost grocery programs and these community-led models were really essential. Here in Boulder, it was kind of amazing to witness because there was a huge scramble and we had to get resources and supplies to people, but having it be community-led was really key. For one, the housing sites in particular blocked outside access in. So if you didn't have a relationship with people who lived there, you couldn't just go and dump a bunch of food there. It was really the residents of those sites who were able to receive the food in a no contact way, bag it up, or some of them did social distance lines where people could still get it. And then some of them did door-to-door delivery for people who weren't leaving their homes. And so it was really essential that we had that kind of community-led model to make sure that we were getting this produce directly to people. And specifically produce, because again, here locally, a lot of the pantries had to standardize their food boxes to get food out. And that really limited, they weren't doing any produce. So they weren't getting any produce out to people. And so this was really, especially for folks who weren't leaving their homes much, their only access to produce. So on a local level, that kind of community-led initiative really thrived. And it wasn't to say we didn't like have to hustle to get things to people, but it worked. It worked in the pandemic. And then on a more national level, we saw organizations starting to share resources like left and right because there was so many unknowns. And especially because when the pandemic hit, there were people on the coast who were like experiencing the effects of it maybe before people in the middle of the country, and or going through different phases of the pandemic and learning about the pandemic at different times. And so we were able to connect and say, what are your volunteer safety protocols? What do you do if somebody gets COVID-19? What are your protocols for the grocery program or for communicating that with people? And so that connection was really important. We started having weekly meetings and making sure that folks had the resources they needed. And we saw an increase in membership. And part of that increase was organizations who were just starting up saying, okay, we need to do this. We need to start a mutual aid project in our community. We need to get food to people. And some of them were about to start, and then COVID hit, and then they were like, okay, we got this thing going. And so we ended up with 10 new members just last year. And we also saw this like regional problem solving as well. The Colorado Food Rescues got together and created a shared pandemic preparedness plan because we often operate a lot of grocery programs that look really similar. So we wanted to make sure that we were able to support each other in terms of like, okay, when this gets bad, how are we going to respond to that? What does that look like? And so because neighborhood stakeholders and community stakeholders are already kind of in their communities and know what's best for their communities, they were really essential in terms of responding to the crisis. These are some of our values that we carry as Food Rescue Alliance. Again, these things that we're doing on the ground around health, around collaboration, around being community driven, get extended all throughout the network. Many of the organizations use volunteers as their primary source of kind of food distribution. That's like a huge part of it. So we do a lot of like understanding how to like really utilize and I would say retain and celebrate volunteerism. And then this last piece around lasting effect is really that we want to understand how do we, as smaller organizations, we might not have as much power or voice in this movement. But as a network, what does our collective power really look like is a question that we're exploring. And so what lasting effect means is we want to utilize this momentum to create real systems change. We know that distributing food isn't going to address the root cause of food insecurity, which is like economic insecurity and wealth distribution. So what would it look like if we got together and really used our voices to be louder? And so some of these were, I feel like we are very solid in this engagement. And some of them, it's like, cool, we have room to grow there. And we're exploring that. In some ways, we're very much a older organization because we've been around since 2013. And in some ways, we're very new because we have previously been pretty underfunded and under-resourced. It's just been kind of slowly growing. And so we have a lot to kind of grow in, I think, as a network. And one way that we're doing that too is through our software. So this is kind of the last piece that I didn't touch on in the what FRA offers to members. But we in 2012 built a software that's actually called the Food Rescue Robot. And really what it does is it organizes and coordinates our logistics from a grocery store to a recipient. That is all tracked. Volunteers can go in and see how to do the shifts. They can input the data about how many pounds of food was rescued. They can input notes about it. And that helps us track our data and understand trends in donation and how much food is going where. So it's like a very essential organizing tool. It's a logistics tool for food rescue. A few years ago, we decided that we needed to either fix some of the bugs in the software, adopt existing software that's out there, or recreate our own. And after a few years of research with somebody at the University of Colorado, who also used to be a consultant for us, we decided we were going to rebuild our own. Nothing else out there really worked for us. But the benefit of that is that we are using the process of building this software as a organizing tool. It's not necessarily a solution to the issues of food rescue or food waste and food insecurity. It doesn't replace things that can't be automated, like relationships, but it does automate things that enable us to free up time so that we can really put our time into building relationships with our community. So the software build itself has been built in a participatory way. Organizations who are engaged in this build get to give feedback on it, but also get to be designers. They get to say, here's the things that I need. Here's the information that helps me make decisions. Here's what my kind of day-to-day work looks like. And we build that into the software. So we've been using the principles of design justice. This is too much text for a slide, but essentially it's this collaborative process where people who are impacted by the outcome actually get to be a part of the entire process. So again, it's a participatory way of building software, which doesn't happen in other kind of technology or software processes. A lot of times we've heard from food rescues across the country who have looked at other softwares and found that, well, they don't quite meet their needs, but they also don't really get a say in what's there. So they have a lot of workarounds, or they don't have access to their data, or they don't have the basic things they need to make decisions. And so we're moving it from this thing that is, owned by Boulder Food Rescue into something that is more cooperatively owned. Ultimately, that's where we want to get to. We're not there yet. We've done one build of it. It's almost ready to have its like kind of second iteration. In the second iteration, we'll add a few features that were in the legacy software that didn't get put in, and we'll do a big data transfer. But we're also exploring, what does cooperative ownership look like? And are there ways that, right now we're primarily using grant funding to fund the software build, but are there ways that we can either share the financial cost of software or the financial gain of software, and exploring ways that maybe it could actually be a source of income at some point in the future. We also don't want it to be barriered for people. So we have similar to sliding scale pay what you can models of cafes. We mimicked ours off of the same cafe in Denver, Colorado, which is a pay what you can model. You can give time by participating in the process. You can give money at a rate that feels right for you. Food Rescue Alliance has membership fees that are also sliding scale, and so it comes with being a part of FRA. But there's a lot of technology that's out there that's really essential for organizations to kind of get off the ground, that's really financially inaccessible. And so we really want to make sure that it's accessible for people who want to start food rescues. And we're also exploring ways that this software can be beneficial for people beyond just food, like mutual aid programs. And so that's kind of where we're at in that process. Ultimately, with this goal of, again, building collective power. What are the ways that we could share data to help have a louder voice about some of these issues? What types of features do people need in order to kind of move towards their goals in terms of what they're doing on the ground? How do they make decisions? Those are the types of questions we're exploring that we're going to be building into it. And it's all iterative and based on input. So we don't know exactly what it all looks like, but it is all in process. And so that's kind of like one big goal of, I believe I'm going to pull this from some of the grant language. This is one big goal of where we're at. And the first one being like, we're growing as an organization. We want to continue facilitating the connections and the peer learning that's happening, but also restructure Food Rescue Alliance so that it's really member driven and moving more towards a social impact network where members can drive the work, where we form working groups and regional groups and things where we make connections and then try to get out of the way so we don't stop the work from happening, and really let the organizations kind of get together and kind of problem solve on their own. And through that system of organizing, we believe that we can create stronger localized solutions to food access, and use our connectivity to build collective power. So that's kind of where we're at right now. And yeah, this is just my thank you slide. I appreciate the opportunity to be here. And also the grant is really, it's huge for us in this way of, again, like I said, we've been around for a little bit, but we're still very brand new. And this is really going to increase the sustainability of Food Rescue Alliance as we are iterating on who we are and where we're going, and growing this movement. So thank you. And that's it. Stop sharing. Answer questions.
Thank you, Hayden. That was a great presentation. If anyone has any questions for Hayden, please drop them in the chat box. I just had a few questions. You mentioned some really interesting things, and one of the things that caught my attention was retention of volunteers. So a lot of nonprofits rely on volunteers, and it's tough to get those volunteers to continue on, especially during a time like the pandemic where people are not feeling safe necessarily. So one of the concerns with that, I think, is that a lot of beneficiaries or the people, communities being served, they build relationships with volunteers. There's a sort of consistency that they depend upon. How have you addressed this with your member organizations? What kind of advice would you give them and other organizations to retain volunteers for that kind of consistency?
Yeah, that's spot on. There are a few things that we have done that have been effective. We talked to volunteers about exactly that too. We're building relationships, and sometimes the volunteers and the grocery program coordinators, who are the people in the communities. So we use volunteers here in a few different ways. Everybody's a volunteer. There's the bike courier volunteers, or the food distribution volunteers, and grocery program coordinators, who are people in their communities distributing food. They'll form relationships, and they'll just connect, and we don't even know about it. They're like, calling each other and figuring things out, and it's really cool. I think front loading, like the importance of relationship, is a really helpful thing. Finding volunteer opportunities that really work for that person, where they feel valued and essential, I think is really important. So the way our food distribution works is, if the volunteer doesn't do it, it doesn't happen, which in some ways can be really, so we also front load that information about what kind of effect that might have. But it also really sets it up so that they're really essential, and they know that there's like this autonomy that exists in that way, as opposed to, I know I've volunteered at programs where I'm like, hey, what do I have to do now? Or, hey, what do I have to do now? And I just feel like kind of more of a burden, or like anybody, like I'm not really utilizing my skills or my strengths to really help out. And so giving people autonomy and trusting, once they're trained and have everything that they need, just really trusting that they're going to show up for that, I think can be really valuable. Matching people with the skills, with their skills and their expertise, I guess, to a program that is really helpful. So that's one way that if somebody has experience with, let's say they have experience with writing, then we're like, great, do you want to like write blogs for us? Or if somebody has experience with marketing, we have a volunteer who does like a lot of our newsletters. Putting people in places where they know that they're bringing something to the organization that wouldn't otherwise maybe be there. So that's, again, like a way to like really value what they bring in a way that feels really substantial and important. And then the last thing I thought of, and this is all off the top of my head, I could probably think of a bunch of things later, but the last thing I thought of was, and this is harder in the pandemic, but prior to the pandemic, trying to create ways that volunteers can meet each other and connect with each other is really helpful. We do, even in the pandemic, we try to do this. We do like online bingo nights and like virtual hangouts and things like that. Trying to increase connectivity across like social media platforms, like if volunteers take photos and share it, other people seeing that. Those are ways that we try to like have fun with it and like really make it an experience where people are having fun. And then we do a lot of volunteer celebrations and like giveaways and like thank yous and lots of like lifting you up and just like really the more time that we spend acknowledging people and really like recognizing them for their work, I think they feel more valued. So when the pandemic hit too, we actually had an increase in volunteers because we're decentralized, I think. So it's a little unique in that way. A lot of places that had big centralized locations and warehouses and lots of people around saw a decrease of volunteers. Because our shifts, you're really kind of on your own for a lot of it. There were a lot of people, I think, who really wanted to get out and also be alone and do something good for the community all at once. And so I think we were really lucky locally in that way, to kind of see that engagement. And so we had so many volunteers here that we were sending them to other places that we're like, oh, check out this program that's happening, or like wait around and shifts will open eventually. So that was also a benefit.
Thank you. That's some really good advice there in terms of just understanding how to build the relationships. So one of the things that we've noticed during the pandemic, and you kind of spoke about this, where volunteers are coming in, but you have a lot of volunteers who just want to help. But one of the things that we notice is there's certain underserved communities. And Claire kind of speaks about this in her question in the chat box. Certain communities are more likely to face poverty or be homeless and also to face food insecurity. What are you doing to ensure that those areas and communities are getting the resources that they need when they don't necessarily have the means to reach out for help?
Yeah, I think this is really, for us, felt like it was about community connection and relationships, because we had been building relationships for 10 years now, with these like traditionally underserved communities. It gave us a little bit of leverage in terms of like who wasn't leaving, who was afraid to go out and access resources. I would also add like undocumented communities particularly. There's a lot of fear and barriers around accessing resources when those public charge rules are in place. And then they weren't also getting the extra stipends that were going out. So some of it was the relationships we had already had, which was really helpful. We started forming new relationships with other community organizers. So here, there's like a lot of like Latinx organizations that are doing like health and well-being work, people who are connecting around housing justice. So working with other organizations who are really connected in the community, because there's trust there, there's already relationships there. And so leveraging those relationships are really important for us. So we did set up like a few new programs because there was another community organizer who was working on housing justice stuff that we were able to work with. So we weren't just like showing up like, hi, you don't know us, but here's a bunch of food. But there was like trust already built. It's almost like a whole network of relationships, I think, that end up kind of spreading the word of like, here's a free resource that it could be available if that's helpful for you all. I think, does that answer the question? I'm trying to remember like all of it.
Yeah. Claire, does that answer? This was Claire's question.
I also didn't read the whole question up on the chat.
Claire, does that answer your question? So her question was, she actually had several questions.
Yeah, it didn't really directly answer it. I know you've worked with communities, but how do you, I think when we're dealing with these sorts of things, you have to seek the community that is going to be less served. It's very easy to find, the ones that are loudest. So what sorts of things do you do to find this, like the indigenous folk that I've researched a little bit, their food insecurity is 90-something% in some cases. That's insanely high. And is just really clearly desperately needs some attention. So that sort of thing, how do you, and the LGBTQAI homeless population of homeless folks in Austin is astronomical. We have tent communities all over. How do you deal with something that is as widespread as tent communities all over a city? It's I admire what you're doing. It's very clear from the things that you're saying that you've thought out a lot of these things and found some really good solutions. I'm just wondering about those particularly hard things to address. What do you do to address them?
Yeah. So to intentionally seek out those communities, I think I would say we would form relationships with people who already have relationships, right? There are organizations working within those communities already. We also have done, some of our roots came from working with the unhoused community too. So we do, some of our staff and people are very connected with, and Boulder's like a smaller city than Austin for sure. But working with organizations who have built trust. So we have an organization here that helps unhoused people get things like tents and sleeping bags and just things they need to survive, right? It's an organization that has no barriers, that just builds community, that builds trust. So we work with them to build those relationships and maybe also distribute food, right? If that feels right for them. So I do think it is about connecting with people who do have those resources and asking those questions, right? Like, who isn't accessing these resources and why? And building those community connections. I think the other place for us, what we really had to change and grow is like hiring people and having people within our organization who are reflective of those communities, right? Making sure that we had people who spoke the same languages, that we have people who look like and have cultural connections to the communities that we were working with. And so part of our process too was, as we grew, making sure that we were bringing on people who are representative of the communities that we tried to serve. Over half of our organization have been former participants of our programs. We try to make sure that we are, and this isn't perfect, but like multicultural, multiracial, cross-class organization, so that we can, and if it's not within our staff team necessarily, in our volunteers teams, in our board team, and that's like an ongoing process, but it's another way, I think, to get to that place of not just building the connections, but knowing the struggles on a deeper level, and being able to relate on a deeper level. And that's like another way that I think we've like kind of had to constantly grow. And the same with the LGBTQ community. I mean, I think most of us are queer people. I don't know, the far majority of us, for whatever reason, we're just a very queer organization. And like, so we know the community, we know the resources, and we know, which organizations are serving homeless youth, which is primarily LGBTQ population. And that helps us because it helps us reach the people who are getting services through other organizations, getting support through other organizations, and then they find us. Same with like mental health services, I would say, having therapists and people in mental health like who know of our program, so that when they have clients, they are able to connect them to us or to some of the grocery programs that are close to them. And so that's kind of how we end up, I think, building those connections.
One of the things that I'm sensing your organization has that's really unique is a culture that we wish all organizations had, where communication and connecting is important, and not in any silly sorts of ways, really meaningful, make a difference sort of ways. And then walking that talk. I really appreciate that and admire that, and wondered if there's anything. I want that sort of thing to be available to other organizations to model. Do you have advice on how to accomplish that? Or have you thought about it? Is it just something that just comes naturally to you?
Thank you. That's really sweet. We do actually, we created a framework, kind of, it's kind of like, it's a little like it's like, how do we, look at our systems and things in place that prevent us from that? So it's like specifically for direct service organizations who maybe have structures in place that show distrust and a lack of communication, to really look at those systems and see, like, do we really need these or not? And we're actually about to publish a little toolkit that is like things like activities to look at, to kind of go internal and see what's kind of blocking people from doing that work. So there's some very tangible things I would be happy to send out, if anybody's interested in looking at those things. And then I think the other thing that kind of came to mind, I was just talking about this earlier, is I think the reason that this is, I don't know if this is totally true, but what I've seen, what I've like gathered, is that a lot of times, I mean, nonprofits are overworked, folks are underpaid, and there's this operation of this like kind of scarcity mentality. And I get it, and I grew up in scarcity, and I know what it I know what it feels like, and I know that struggle. And I think if we're constantly in that, like, there's not going to be enough, then it's just like, how do we just get the things done as soon as possible? And I think, like, if we can pause and look at that and flip it a little bit and value, like you said, like really put relationships first. It takes like an intentional, like, slowing down. Building meaningful relationships takes time. Following up with people around their feedback takes time. It takes a lot of energy. And so I think there's this like fear of putting all that time in. And so it's really just about like sharing, like, it actually is going to build better systems and systems that work better for people. And just to like kind of flip it and value it first, I think is something that's really helpful, but it also takes like a lot of emotional work too. I think that's been a big part of it. Like, I was saying, sometimes it feels like I just have to watch my ego crumble over and over, just to be like, I don't know what's best. What do y'all think? And like, that can be hard sometimes too. But I do think, I really believe, because I've like seen it, like, if we can do that work, like, we're actually going to create something that's going to be ultimately more sustainable, and just like values people and respects people more. So I believe in the work, and I'd be happy to share anything that we've learned so far.
Excellent. Really, I'm enjoying this so much. I'll let somebody else ask some questions. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, we definitely would love to see what kind of resources that you can put out there for smaller organizations, especially just getting started, learning how to build that kind of culture. How have you been getting how have you been able to get member organizations and volunteers to build relationships with each other? Because that's one of the things that we've noticed with organizations, or member organizations, where there's not as much sort of collaboration in that relationship building, because there's not a collective culture around it.
We have connected members with similar kind of, again, struggles and interests and things that they're working on. So that's one way that we have like, I guess, kind of built that kind of collaborative culture. I think there's, because I don't know if this is totally true, but a lot of organizations who join are pretty new, and they get a lot of support and resources and direct advice from those organizations, and I think they want to give back. So I think that because there's this like kind of like culture of sharing, there's also this like culture of like wanting to give, like, to like receiving and giving being like this reciprocal process. So I find like a lot of organizations tell me like, oh my God, I've learned so much here, anything I could do, but I don't feel like I know anything. And so really like lifting that up a little bit, you're like, yes, you do, you know a lot. That's one way of like, I think, building that culture. I think the regional collaborations have been really helpful and important. I've connected with other people in similar positions as me. That's like another interesting connection, like connecting program directors together, or executive directors together, because there's just like certain I don't know, things that happen in roles that can be volunteer coordinators together. That's like a huge one, because there's just so much to talk about, like how do you do this? And so kind of building networks and alliances across positions I found to be really helpful. And I think it's like another thing that we're also exploring too, like how do we create better connectivity? One kind of thing I've noticed is if we take too much, like if we do too much work, it's almost like we rely on the folks who are running the network to just do the thing. And lately I've been like, what would happen if we just connect people and then just like get out of the way and just let, like, what would happen, you know? So one thing that I'm kind of curious about is that same question. How do we build more meaningful connections so that they're kind of ongoing? Those are the things I've seen like work really well so far, but I'm also really interested in exploring it more.
Really appreciate all your answers that you go so in depth into them. It's been really helpful. And we actually do have a few people on here who are a few volunteers who are doing food related service, not necessarily food rescue. So this is,
Yeah.
I'm sure, helpful for them as well. One of my questions, and this goes back to an earlier question with Claire in terms of underserved communities. So there are specific communities, such as Latin American communities, even Asian American communities, where there is a cultural standard of not seeking out help, simply because, you know, cultural pride or just food insecurity is a very sensitive subject, and not necessarily everyone wants other people to know. How do you deal with that aside from relationships? How do you seek out those people and those communities so that you can help them? And is there a way that you can kind of distribute food to them without it seeming like, I guess, charity for a lot of those groups?
Yeah. I think that one thing that we have done that has been beneficial is having people, again, that are from that same cultural background. Like, you know, our community outreach manager is an immigrant from Colombia, like can connect with people. It's beyond just language, right? It's culture, it's the experience of being a single mom in the US, right? So that's like one place where I think that connection happens. Because there are community leaders who are distributing the food, I think that's the other place that the connection happens. And by community leaders, I mean it's neighbors. It's neighbors distributing to neighbors. And so because of that, they're able to be like, no, it's okay. We have so much. Right? This is for everybody here. No paperwork, no like, you know, lines, nothing like that, because that also can just create people have expressed they have to like prove their poverty over and over again. If people are using it, they need it. It's usually the other way around, right? Like people perceive other people need it more and don't take enough food, like it was said. And so like trying to create community around it, I think has been really helpful. It's more of like, here's a resource that is in abundance. How can we share this? Another thing that a lot of our grocery programs participants did was they got really excited about the recipes they were like making with different types of foods that received a lot, and wanted to share recipes to other people in other programs. And so then we had a participant created recipe book that we just like helped like put all together and translate across specifically English and Spanish here is where other two primary languages that are spoken here. But that's been helpful. And like just a way that people can connect across the different types of food. It's still a thing though. It certainly is a process of, I guess, destigmatizing. I think taking away those barriers is one way to do that, but the stigma, I think, definitely still exists. And so through making it more about building community, which again in the pandemic was a little hard because we're like, no, you can't actually see each other. Really, you can't hang out. That, you know, like making it about like more of a celebration and a way of sharing and a way of building community. Sometimes people bring other things. They're like, hey, anybody want some food? So I did have extra or whatever, kind of making it more of a playful event. And that's not us doing that. It's just what people do. And I think that's been really helpful in terms of that. And I think it's an ongoing thing in terms of destigmatizing.
And going along with that, is there a way where volunteers can source culturally appropriate food? Because you mentioned the recipe book. So how do you provide food that people and communities are familiar with and which they feel comfortable, know how to cook it, they prefer it?
Yeah, it's an area where I think we in Boulder are still trying to grow, and we're learning from some other organizations in Denver and Colorado Springs and people who've been doing this well. If it's just food that we receive from a grocery store, it's primarily produce, but there's certainly there's certainly things that like aren't used at all, or things that people want more of. So one thing we try to do is match certain donations with certain grocery programs based on what would be culturally appropriate. If there's extra that's just like, or if we know like this shit is never gonna hit the mark, we'll send it somewhere else, or we'll do something where we drop some food that feels better for folks in one community and take the rest to pantry and distribute it out to another community, things like that. So we've been able to work around it, but it's a little bit of a limitation for sure, because we can't necessarily control what the store gives us. Another couple of ways we've been able to improve that a little bit is we do source food donations from farmers and gardeners. And so especially if we're encouraging people to grow extra, we'll tell them what types of foods communities want and what types of foods are maybe in short supply to kind of match that cultural appropriate desire. And then this year in the pandemic, this was a new program for us, but we purchased food for the first time. We got some additional funding to essentially purchase additional food to supply to our grocery programs. We supported local BIPOC, Black, Indigenous, people of color-led farms, and younger farmers, and this food hub down in Denver that's also POC led, and then purchase the foods that people specifically wanted. So it was a way to essentially support the farmers who lost some of their funding stream, get the grocery programs more food, and supply them with more culturally appropriate foods. So we've been able to grow a little bit in that area. It's another area that we're trying to explore more. I think without autonomy, over like complete autonomy over the like land and what we're able to grow in our food systems, it can be a constant struggle, especially without a warehouse that we can sort and redistribute food. So we're growing and learning in that area. We are probably going to do some food purchasing again, but we're not sure if it's going to be an ongoing program.
If anyone wants to reach you, learn more, what is the best way to do that?
You can email me at hayden@foodrescuealliance.org or hayden@boulderfoodrescue.org. They'll both get to me. Email is probably the easiest way, but we can totally set up a time to connect beyond email if that's helpful. I can put it in the chat. Would that be helpful?
Yeah, that'd be great. And then definitely people can also find you on the website, www.foodrescuealliance.org as well, right? No, thank you so much for this wonderful presentation. I just wanted to see, is there anything else you'd like to share, you'd like people to know about your work and how can they support you?
Yeah, I mean, I would say definitely check out our website. I can put Boulder Food Rescues up as well. Reach out if you have any questions. And again, I'd be happy to share any of those resources that we have created. So besides just those like how to start your own food rescue guides and things, Boulder Food Rescues put out some resources on participation and also food access, and some of those barriers to food access we've studied pretty deeply as well. So I'm happy to share any of that. And I just say reach out and we'll go from there.
Thank you so much. FBB is really happy to support the work that you're doing, and we've learned so much. We are so excited for this, especially as we ourselves are launching our own food insecurity program that once again, that's a monthly grant to each of our BBN teams. So again, anyone who wants to learn more, just visit the website, please email Hayden. And then if you want to get updates on FBB, you can text FBB to 22828, and we will also be providing updates on Food Rescue Lines as well. Oh, so sorry, we do have one more question, it looks like. Dan Field has asked, is there any involvement with faith organizations doing the same, and does it present complications?
Some organizations probably, I don't know how many actually across the country work with faith organizations. I'm sure that many of the food rescues distribute food out to churches, who will probably distribute out to people, or probably not just churches. One thing that we always say is that food, like there's one kind of like, I guess, value or thing that would prevent, which is that there's no mandatory proselytization. Can't even say that word. So you don't have to, like, we won't work with organizations who force people to be praying or do anything that's against their religion, or not their religion, or not what they want to do in order to access food. So if there's any type of mandatory religious component, we won't work with them. But otherwise, I think they're a source of food distribution for a lot of food rescues across the country.
I think that's especially the case in certain communities. All right, well, thank you so much, Hayden. That was a wonderful presentation.
Yeah, thank you all so much, and thank you all for the support. We're thrilled to be a part of this network, and just really can't believe it, and so happy to be here. So thank you.